Hi, everyone. My name is Kevin Navratil, and I am the Democracy Commitment Coordinator and Political Science Professor at Moraine Valley. And I am joined by Dr. DeWitt Scott, Student Support Specialist. Hey, DeWitt, how are you today?
I'm good. I'm good. Kevin, how about you?
Good, thanks. And thank you to those who are in the virtual audience. You'll have plenty of opportunities if you have any questions or comments and want to contribute to our discussion today, please do so. Looking forward to getting as many contributions as possible. So today's event is titled about how cultural issues might be influencing elections. And I've been thinking about this topic for quite some time. I think traditionally and perhaps intuitively, issues like tax cuts and tax increases, healthcare, education spending, inflation, jobs, and infrastructure, kind of these basic material issues, are some of the big drivers of elections. And depending upon which of these issues might be more prominent, it might benefit one political party over the other. Um, However, it's been clear that social issues like abortion, race-related issues, including Black Lives Matters, critical race theory, LGBTQT issues, and more recently, we've seen kind of a standoff in Florida with the Walt Disney Company and Governor DeSantis, and we talk about that later. But standing during the national anthem was an issue during the 2016 election. Religion, immigration, guns, being soft on crime, all of these topics are increasingly important. Um, but I also think there's a case to be made that perhaps they always have. The more I've thought about this topic, social issues have been prominent in several elections. You could probably go back to the 1960s and issues on crime and um, the Southern Strategy by Richard Nixon of kind of law and order. And I'm thinking of the 1988 election with Bush, the first Bush and Dukakis, and um, there was the Willie Horton ad, which
Important ad.
perhaps we'll show later, perhaps, and discuss that. But issues on, again, getting related to race and perhaps crime. Um, and more recently, at least when I was in graduate school, I remember in 2005, there was an author, Thomas Frank. He wrote this book called What's the Matter with Kansas? He's basically trying to understand why so many people vote against their economic interests. And instead vote on cultural issues. And in 2004, the number one issue in the 2004 election, for according to the exit polls, was social issues, moral issues, and the specific one in particular that was big at that time was same-sex marriage. There was actually many conservative leading states who had banning same-sex marriage on the ballot back in 2004 to help drive voter turnout. Um, so that's a little bit of the context, and I guess I'll just end with this little preamble by saying that I think it's my opinion that Republicans are much better at using social issues to win elections. I think it creates a divide between college and non-college educated voters. And I think this is really particularly a problem on the Democratic side. The decline of unions and many former blue collar jobs have been eliminated either due to globalization or automation. And so one of the things I guess I just wanted to hopefully grapple with today is the impact that this might have on elections in general, but how perhaps the Democrats are uniquely um, in a bad position if elections are really primarily being, if the main issues that are being discussed are more social than material. So I'll leave it at there for right now and turn it over to my co-host, Dr. Scott, and see what your thoughts are.
No, Kevin, everything you said was spot on, and really pertinent because, of course, this is a midterm year. So a lot of these things are like popping up, like crazy, even more so than they have been in the past. And it's it's actually funny because you mentioned DeSantis when you first started talking, and you talked about how these sort of things play to the Republican advantage. Just this discussion that we're having today, we literally could just talk purely about DeSantis and his actions, or Governor Abbott in Texas. Like we could just talk about like those two and cover every single topic that we have outlined for today and how it relates to the political atmosphere. But I agree with you. I do think the Republican Party they're much more focused. They do a better job of capitalizing on issues that sort of hit home with their voter base, taking it, expanding it, and sticking with it all the way through. Versus Democrats, which typically Democrats try to do that. Democratic Party tries to do that to some degree. They don't do it as well. And then Democrats, you know this better than I do, so maybe you correct me. The Democratic Party always seems to have like a super radical left that divides the group much more than the we'll call radical right of the Republicans, right? It seems like the radical right of Republicans is um, a lot more loyal to the Republican Party. They may question some things and they may have problems with some things, but at the end of the day, the loyalty is still there, even if it's reluctant. Whereas the radical left, as I understand it, the radical left almost just carries themselves that they hate the Democratic Party, period, and that they would rather sacrifice a a centrist or a center leaning Democrat. They would rather sacrifice that person just to get a radical left agenda, and I think that's the biggest difference, and why you sort of have the what I want to say, the success of a Republican Party versus a Democratic Party. It seems the Democratic Party is just a little bit more divided, whereas the Republican Party is like, hey, Republican power at all costs, um, and that's why they jump on these issues in the way that they do. So yeah, I think everything that you say is really really spot on, and something that people need to talk about a little bit more. I think you're still on mute.
Thank you, DeWitt. Um, yeah, I mean, I think the way that you summarize that with the differences between the Democrats and Republicans is pretty accurate, and at least from my perception, if the radical side of the Republican Party tends to be more of the pushes the direction of the party, and the rest of the party kind of gets behind it. Whereas I think, as you described with the more radical left, if anything, they divide the party and create divisions that end up splintering into many different groups. And so, perhaps we could talk about specifics with that. But you also mentioned about DeSantis and Abbott, and I think I just kind of passed over Disney, and I can't say that I've been following this super closely, but basically a little bit of an overview of that particular issue is that Florida had passed legislation that basically banned educators from teaching about sexuality and what I'm just trying to remember the specifics of it. The critics are calling it the "Don't Say Gay" bill, but
Yeah.
basically saying that you're not going to be teaching about in kindergarten through third grade, that you're not going to be teaching about subjects that could be dealing with same-sex couples, and so because of that, there's been a pushback of some companies like Disney that said they're no longer going to contribute to Republican. They're no longer going to donate to Republicans who supported that bill, and basically, you know, that they have criticized Republicans, including Governor DeSantis, for passing that bill. And so DeSantis and Republicans have pushed back. I think I saw some headlines this weekend of many kind of supporters of DeSantis like blocking the entrance into
Yeah.
Disney. So,
That was so
and
crazy.
yeah, and calls to potentially revoke kind of their status of having this special district in Florida that
Mhm.
they've had since I think 1967. That's given Disney the ability to kind of operate independently in Florida. So, it, these kind of standoffs, I think, are consistent with this idea of like the role of social issues. And
Mhm.
so this certainly isn't the only state that's kind of been moving to restrict certain education topics in the classroom. I know we've had previous discussions about critical race theory, so there's been many states that are banning this in K through 12, despite there not being any critical race theory being taught K through 12. And then, there's topics like transgender athletes being banned from participating in sports, and this has happened in a few different states. Just trying to think if it's Utah being one of them, where I think the state had done a survey and there was something like four transgender athletes and perhaps only one that was competing in female athletics. And the governor, who was a Republican, had actually vetoed this bill, but he was overridden. And so the point being here with the few number of actual, it's just such a minimal number of people who are impacted. But so why would it? So the point being is it isn't really a problem
Mhm.
in the scale of hundreds of thousands of athletes who are competing, but yet it's viewed. All of these issues are viewed as I guess successful strategies. Either viewed, it's hard to understand the motives of the supporters, so I guess I don't want to become too psychoanalytical here,
Mhm.
but perhaps they view these issues as necessary. But I think the takeaway, the interpretation that and I think others have, is that it's at least a successful electoral strategy, that it's going to motivate and energize the base, and as you mentioned, the kind of the far more conservative members of the Republican Party, and energize them to participate, get involved, vote in elections.
Yeah, and no, I would agree. And thinking about all of these issues, and like you said, we covered some of them before with Black Lives Matter and many of those things. I think really, and we talked about it before, but the idea that the Republican Party is, we're going to do what we have to do in order to gain the seats of power, and then once we get in those seats of power, they move very quickly, right? The Republican Party does not hesitate in pushing the policies through that they want, right? We see how quickly the abortion issue has just swept states, right? It started off as just one or two states, but now it's literally just sweeping through very quickly. Um, and another example that people on the radical left, which people I tend to be around um, often point to, is if we look at the last Supreme Court nominee, not Ketanji Brown Jackson, but the one before, I forget her name. Um,
Amy Coney Bryant.
Yes, and I think she got pushed through in like less than 50 days or something like that, with the idea that Trump is in office, Ruth Bader Ginsburg has passed. Now Trump doesn't have much time, but we're going to do whatever we have to do. We're going to come together as a base, whether we like each other or whether we hate each other, right? We're going to come together as a base and make sure that we get this seat filled. And then you compare that to 2016, right, when Obama was in his last year and Scalia died, right, and you had so much infighting in the Democratic Party between mainstream Democrats and radical left about who should be nominated. Then Merrick Garland got nominated, but never ever got to the point of being pushed through. And Obama had far more time to get it done than Trump, right? And so when you see that and you see the difference, for one, in my eyes, this is how I see the Republican Party is always competitive, because numbers wise, I don't think they could ever be competitive. But the fact that they do not hesitate and they are unified makes them far more competitive. And just the infighting on the left makes it very hard to get things done in a way. Like, it just seems like the radical left feels like they're sellouts if they acquiesce to the mainstream left. But whereas the radical right, they don't. They might fight behind doors, but they shake hands in public. And yeah, when thinking about Don't Say Gay bill and thinking about abortion and thinking about the transgender bathrooms, thinking about Disney, all of it, it's perfect for a midterm year, but uh, I see it regardless of if you're a Republican, regardless of where you stand, come November, you're going to side with Republican leadership.
Yeah, I think you're right. The abortion topic, there's been several states, Kentucky, Florida come to mind, that have essentially eliminated the right to an abortion by having such a limited amount of time, to where in the first several weeks, if there's not an abortion, then it's illegal, and really carving out, there's no exceptions for rape or incest.
Yeah,
um,
or
you
human
know
trafficking.
yeah, right. So, and the reason I bring this up is that, to your, like, I think when Democrats go extreme, there's usually a backlash. If the far left gets their way, there's usually a backlash. And so it'll be interesting to see, you know, um, the conventional theory is that, in midterm elections like we have now, which 2022, so there's no presidential election. We call them midterms. It's the midterm of the president's term in office. And typically the party that is in office, which is currently Democrats holding the presidency, they generally lose seats in the House of Representatives. Historically, there's only been a couple of exemptions to that kind of rule. So when you put that in consideration with the fact that there's really high inflation, the pandemic's still looming, and there's just kind of an exhaustion with that.
Russia, Ukraine.
Russia, Ukraine. There seems to be so many headwinds against the Democrats that basically the conventional wisdom is that Republicans could just basically walk through this election without really having to do anything to get their voters energized or to put forward some issue. But despite that, they're I don't know, it could be risky, but or they're viewing this as like just an opportunity to really get what they want. They really are going after pretty extreme positions with regard to abortion, with banning what's being taught in classrooms. The list goes on and on. So I don't know. I guess there's a question about whether this will potentially hurt them in any way with Republican moderates or centrists or people who consider themselves independent. Um, but then you bring that good example with kind of the differences with the Supreme Court nominees, and Trump or Obama had something like 11 months left in his office and ended up, the left wing wanted him to nominate a very kind of left wing justice, and he ends up nominating somebody that apparently George W. Bush had considered nominating himself with Merrick Garland. So this was really a concession. I think that Obama picked somebody who was much more centrist. And of course, this nominee never even got a hearing, despite having a lot of support previously from Senators Orrin Hatch of Utah and many other really conservative senators. And with the argument being, well, there's an upcoming presidential election. So Scalia had passed away, was at the very end of January, perhaps end of February, but I think it was the end of January, and there's a presidential election in November, so like 10 months away or whatever. Prevented them from saying, well, we're not going to nominate, we're not going to have a Senate hearing over somebody who, considering there was an election 10 months away, whereas my numbers could be wrong, but I think Ruth Bader Ginsburg had passed away in September,
Yeah,
something like that. So
yeah.
people were actually, because of early voting, people were actually already voting. Millions of people had actually voted in the 2020 election by the time Amy Coney Barrett was nominated to the Supreme Court. And so the point being is like that principle of not nominating or approving somebody in a presidential election wasn't consistent
It was so
across.
hypocritical. Yeah, and I think it was Mitch McConnell who said in 2016, because Obama is on his way out, he should not be allowed to choose justice. And then he said, "You can quote me and use my words against me in the future if need be." And then 2020 came and he said, "Yeah, I know I said that, but this is different."
And I think he qualified that by saying, well, now I meant, well, when the Republic, whoever, that it's up to the whoever has the majority in the Senate. So he's saying that in a case where so in Trump's example, the Republicans had the majority of the Senate and held the presidency. So then he qualified. Right. So it's a moving target, I guess, of what the standards are.
Yeah,
But,
it's power at all costs, no matter what. Whatever I have to do to get in power.
and you're not the first one to have used that claim. And I guess uh, it, but it's successful.
Yes.
And, I guess part of the argument is why isn't that similarly successful for Democrats? And that's something perhaps we can get into. But let me turn it back to you and see what thoughts or new directions you might want to spin this, DeWitt.
Yeah. So just to pick up right there where you left off, why is it not successful for the Democrats? Or why do Democrats view it differently? Why is there not just this fanatic loyalty no matter what? And I think it's more so because um, the radical left sees themselves as just not Democrats, period. Right? You can ask someone, or I don't want to say ask someone, you can ask a person who may be extremely radical left, right? They're all for defunding of the police, which is a term that scares a lot of people, right, on the right and left. Prison abolition, another term that scares a lot of people on the right or left. But the radical left would say these are the terms we're using, but listen to the details and you'll understand. These are people who don't consider themselves Democrats. And actually are insulted if you call them Democrats. Um, there's a radical left that really does not like Obama. It certainly doesn't like Biden. And just it feels that. So the reason that you can't get that sort of success that you would get on the right with using cultural issues is just because the left, like as I said, the radical left. I'm putting myself in their shoes. I'm not a Democrat. I'm not.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not a Democrat. So if a Democrat gets in office, I lost. And if a Republican gets in office, I lost. And it's the idea that so they get challenged and say, well, what do you want? There are two major parties. This is where we are right now. The radical left says, well, I can imagine a world that's more radical and more different than what I have now. And just because you can't see it doesn't mean that you shouldn't go for it, right? I can imagine it, so I want to bring it into existence. And someone who may be a more pragmatic or pragmatist would say, yeah, but that's going to take 75 years. Right, it's gonna be you're 100 years behind before we close all the prisons. Right, you're 50 years behind before we start to really just shut down the police. So you're really just wasting your time, and you're allowing the right to come in, slowly grab up more and more seats and more power. Now you don't have abortion. Now you don't have certain books can't be in schools, all because of this radical left group who is just saying yes. But let's imagine a place where when there's a robbery, we can call a social worker who can come in and speak to the armed robber and say, "Hey, take this gun out of your hand, please." Um, that's just what I see. The radical left. I mean, you can even if you ask them, left isn't even good enough, right? They have to say that. I don't know what could be on the other side of left, right? But and that's why you don't have that success. You just it's not two parties. It's actually three, right? There's a right, there's a left, and then there's this outer group who challenges the other two. And it really just divides the left. So,
Well, I think I at least will agree with that part. I'll start off by agreeing with the part about kind of the purity, moral purity, if you will, of the far left. And, you've mentioned it a few times, and it makes me think of 2016 when Hillary Clinton ended up being the Democratic nominee. Many Sanders supporters were upset and ended up either not voting, and some of which ended up voting for Trump. And at least 10% of Sanders supporters who ended up voting for Trump. So potentially turning the election. And so, and then of course there was many Green Party members too who decided to vote for Jill Stein and instead of Hillary Clinton too. So the Green Party being more left than the Democratic Party. So like they'd rather have their ideals and I guess standards than having political power by having Hillary Clinton be president. And we can think of other examples like that too. But I do think that whereas Trump, there were some people, on the right who said never Trump, the never Trumpers, and some of them are high-profile former Republicans. But there was many Republicans, including Mitch McConnell, who were like, well, if Trump's your nominee, you get behind him. And you get behind him in part for what, DeWitt, you already mentioned, of getting the Supreme Court nominees, three of which were appointed during President Trump, as well as a lot of, federal district courts and circuit courts. And so you use somebody in the Christian right, I think, viewed him, despite, being a man who I think's been married three times. And, I think
Yeah.
one, and objectively, you could say there's a lot of flaws, as far as the morality or ethics of President Trump, but yet,
To put it mildly.
right, I'm trying to be objective here, but I think people got behind him because they saw he could be kind of a sledgehammer who would get things done for their causes. And so there wasn't that kind of ideological purity that you might see from very kind of I'm thinking of like the born again Christian, evangelical Christians who might, have kind of this moral high ground. They're like, no, we're not going to support this person. No, they did, because they saw it as being very optimal to their cause.
Yeah, a necessary evil.
And so you brought up kind of reasons why the Democrats might not be as successful at this. And I think there's some systemic kind of structural issues with the Senate being more biased towards Republicans, and of course, gerrymandering that has favored Republicans recently as well. But I feel like, there were Democrats. It's easy to say now in the last, let's say, 20 years or at least 15 years, that Democrats are really less competitive in the Senate because of having 50 states. Most blue states that historically vote Democrat are generally less than 20. There's usually around 15 to 18. And there's a good, 25 or more states that are generally Republican. And many of those are more rural, smaller states. I'm thinking of your South Dakota, North Dakota, Nebraska, Wyoming's. But they've had, not that long ago, Democratic senators.
Hmm.
And so it kind of begs the question, what's going on there? And there's probably a lot deeper analysis and insightful analysis than what I would have to contribute. But I did want to share one potential theory, and it's I'm going to share this real quick, share my screen, and it's looking at the coalition of the Democrats and Republicans, and perhaps many people know this already, but currently Democrats are in recent years have kind of been traditionally a party that is, if you look at the demographics, it's primarily college educated minorities, African Americans in particular, but Hispanics as well. Um, and
Urban cities.
urban areas for sure. In the last 4 years, you could many suburbs have also trended towards Democrats. But what I think gets lost in this is, so there's this huge, what they call it, the diploma divide of those who have a 4-year degree versus those who don't. And what I'm currently showing you, this is from an article from the New York Times, the date, yeah, Nate Cohn from this September 2021, How Educational Differences Are Widening America's Political Rift. And this is just looking at whites with and without a college degree, and you can kind of go back. And the point that I want to raise is that historically, there either wasn't much of a difference between, having a college education or not between Democrats and Republicans, and or that Democrats had an advantage in this era of like the 60s and even in the 1980s all the way to 2000s. There was, I remember looking at exit polls from the 2000 election, and really, there wasn't much of a difference, but, you were expecting that Democrats would do pretty well with whites without a college degree because they were traditionally like union workers and tradespeople and so forth. And, in the last 20 years, it's really just been um, a sharp difference, as you can see with this. And this is, again, just looking at whites. And so the coalition here, and I think this is really where the social issues fits in, is that if, as DeWitt's saying, the far left is kind of leading some of the messaging and identity and issues, the social issues that are more prominent amongst Democrats, are from the college educated in perhaps urban and more elite people, and how that might be polarizing to those who have don't have a degree, who are white. And I think I have something here too from the Cook report about how the Democrats, it isn't just whites without a college degree. This is from the Cook report. Let me see if I can make this just a little bit bigger. Political report. And this is looking at non-college, college, women non-college, men college, and men non-college. And this is again, voters of color. And there is a decrease in all of these groups. And so, and the expectations is that this is going to grow in 2022, 2024. Stop this right now. Stop sharing, I guess. And it made me think, I think it was this week or last, there was a Vice article that was Vice News had shared this text between Republican Ohio Senate candidate J.D. Vance with his Yale College roommate. And according to Vice News, this has been verified that this was a legit text that he had shared with his former college roommate. And then he's referring to the Republican Party. And this is in quotes, "We are, whether we like it or not, the party of lower income, lower education white people. And I've been saying this for a long time, that we need to offer those people something," and that's in all caps, something. And hell, maybe even expand our appeal to working class Black people in the process, or a demagogue would. Now we're at that point. Trump is the fruit of the party's collective neglect. It makes me think about how "Make America Great Again," what that campaign slogan for Trump was really getting at, is such an appeal to perhaps whites without a college degree, particularly in the industrial heartland. I'm thinking of your Wisconsins, your Iowa, Ohio, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and so forth. And the people that Trump was really targeting of police officers and military, and why he made that standing during the national anthem and chastising people like Colin Kaepernick for kneeling during this national anthem, that issues like this might really make people without a college education, particularly whites, which are the majority of voters, gravitate more towards the Republican Party. Do you think that has some merit to it?
I do. I do think that that has a tremendous amount of merit. That the Democratic Party is losing its stranglehold on that particular group. The ironic thing about all of it, right? This is a conversation I've had with a number of people before. When it comes to just pure values, right? We're talking personal values, cultural values. And I'm speaking as a Black person living in the Black community my entire life. The Black community itself is overwhelmingly conservative in its values. All right. And what I mean is that the number one institution in the Black community since slavery has been the church, right? Most of our influences have been the church. Whether you were strictly Christian or not, you spent a significant amount of time in the church. In the church is the Black church is extremely homophobic, right? Obviously, there are exceptions, but overall, historically, extremely homophobic, right? So there's the anti-LGBTQ aspect of it. In the Black church, historically, it's been frowned upon for women to have an abortion, right? So it's very anti-abortion historically. When you think about Black church, Black elders, there's always been an aversion to welfare, right? There's always been that this is a handout, this is improper, you should not be doing this. This is a sign of you being lazy, right? The patriarchal values, right? Women have their roles, men have their roles. Transgender is just not even a thing that's even been conceived of in the church, in the Black church historically, right? Overall, and thinking about the Republican Party, Black people are Republican at heart, right? it may be a controversial statement, but black people are Republican at heart historically. And so someone would ask, well, why is the black community so tied to the Democratic Party, right? Even when you were showing those stats about the declining loyalty to the Democratic Party, I think for black people, it is not a whole lot of change there. There's still, you go and you vote Democrat all the way down. And if you figure if the black community is so conservative, then why the so much loyalty for Democrats? And it's the idea that as black people, we have always seen the Republican Party as racist, right? So yes, as a community, we could check every single box of what black people and Republicans sort of meet up, but this one box is just what the community just can't get past, and that's the racism, right? That no matter what, yes, you have a black church, someone who's deep in the black church, who's anti-LGBTQ, who's anti-abortion, who does not believe in teaching sexuality, and K-3 schools, who does not even understand critical race theory. This is a black person, and you say, well, why won't you vote Republican? Because that person would say, because I know a KKK member is going to vote Republican. I know someone from the alt-right is going to vote Republican. They have that group. They have that group. So I just cannot align myself with a party where I know someone who is, what's the guy? He's filing for bankruptcy.
InfoWars guy.
Yes, Jones.
Alex Jones, yeah.
Yeah, I know he's going to vote Republican. You just know it, right? You know that David Duke is going to vote Republican. So as a black person who's checks all these boxes down the line, is like, nope, I just can't do it. I can't do it. I have to be over here, right? It almost seems that a strategy, a good strategy for winning consistently, at least a black vote, would be if a Republican Party could sort of mitigate some of the perceived racism, which I say perceived, but I believe it to be true. The perceived racism in the Republican Party, they could easily get the black vote and probably many other minority votes and never look back, right? And just, and don't even have to play the cultural games of the fear mongering about Willie Horton, as you mentioned, back with Dukakis and Bush. And like all of that wouldn't even be necessary if they could just somehow or another eliminate the perceived racism.
That's an interesting points, and I think that one could do a similar analysis for Latina / Hispanic voters as well. That there's a lot of
your camera's off, Kevin. I don't know if you meant to have it off.
Thank you. So yeah, that one could do a similar analysis with Latinas that have a lot of, and we're generalizing here. That's what we have to do based on the data that we have, but we're saying that a majority or a strong majority of a group with a certain racial ethnic background might vote in a particular way. But that being said, that, as far as religion, a lot of strong Catholics who are Hispanic, a lot of economic issues that I think are consistent, that might be a natural fit for Latinas to be part of the Republican Party. And it wasn't that long ago, 2000 election, I think it was, George Bush just lost this group of voters by like 4%, something like that. Whereas by 2008, Obama had 67% support of groups who identified as Hispanic who voted for Obama in 2008. So, if you look at some of the swing battleground states and states like Florida that have been less of a battleground state lately and lean towards Republicans, it's, I think, in no small part because of what you just mentioned. If Democrats just slip up a little bit amongst blacks and Hispanics, that their margins are going to go down. And so when you start to look at issues, and I think we brought this up again, but in a small amount of time, that there's a 2015 Supreme Court case on same-sex marriage. There was a 2016 executive order by Obama dealing with Title IX interpretation for transgender bathrooms. There was also executive orders late in the Obama presidency for deferred action on childhood arrivals, to basically defer deportment on undocumented immigrants, millions of undocumented immigrants. And so in a short amount of time period, there was a lot of issues going on. And I think Donald Trump and Republicans, this kind of MAGA faction of the Republican Party, Make America Great Again, were able to kind of seize on those kind of cultural touchstones on top of some of the other ones that we mentioned, kneeling during the national anthem and abortion, and kind of use that as momentum to really propel them in 2016. And what's been interesting to me is, like, Mitch McConnell he's a Senate minority leader, has refused to issue like a party platform for the upcoming election.
Mm-hmm.
In part because I just don't think they have to, but I guess we're seeing it at the state level, what appears to be some of the most prominent, priorities of Republicans. And again, it could be because they believe it's merited, and that these are really necessary changes to ban teaching certain curriculum and critical race theory or LGBTQ issues and so forth, or it could just be more of a strategy to try to get out the vote.
Mm-hmm.
Just invite people too. I know we still have quite a few attendees in the audience, so feel free to, let us know if you see things differently. Let us know if there's questions you have, things that you would like us to talk about. And I'll turn it back over to you, DeWitt.
Yeah, so I think when it comes to this idea of seizing power, right? And I don't know if you have the Willie Horton clip, but I think that would be great. Some of the people listening may be a bit young, or they just may not know too much about it. But thinking about what I call the fear mongering of the right, right? The right typically uses fear in order to galvanize the base, whereas the left or far left tries to use ideals. What is the perfect world that you can envision? What is this utopia that you want? Let's rally around that. Whereas the right is like, this is what will happen if you don't vote for us. Bad things will happen, right? And I think about the Willie Horton ad, which I know you're looking for it now, but the whole idea about there's this man who is incarcerated and he's been furloughed. He's allowed to be out for a weekend, and while he's out, he commits some very heinous crimes, right? That was a very bad situation. And then the way it's framed in the ad, the TV ad, makes it even more scary, right? I didn't see the ad until I was grown. I was a full adult when I it was like it was way after 2010 when I first saw it. But when I saw the ad, I got scared. I'm like, this guy looks like he's gonna come to my house right now and hurt me, right? And when you think about it, I was like, I can see how someone could be, um, I want to say scared or pushed into a, oh God, I don't want that to happen, so I'm going to vote against anyone who wants this sort of activity to happen for incarcerated people. And that's just a pattern, right? That's the pattern. That's the whole idea behind the whole transgender thing is, oh, you can't have transgenders bathrooms because you're going to have a transgender woman who's going to be in the bathroom, and it's going to be, it's not going to work out. Your child's going to be in the bathroom with that person. And, all of that, and it's just the fear mongering, right?
Fear.
Yeah.
So yeah, I do have that clip. I wish I remember. I think I learned it when I was in college 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago. But there's a lot of context related to this ad. I could be wrong on some of them, but I do know that the furlough program was not something. So Governor Dukakis of Massachusetts was leading, I think, at one point by 10% in the summer over George H.W. Bush. So it looked like he was going to be the next president after 8 years of Reagan. So I think I believe that to be true, but I also remember things like Willie wasn't even the name he went by. It may have been William, so, and like the picture with the afro, like they really had to dig back to get that one. And so, they really created this kind of boogeyman. And there's been analysis looking at the 2016 election of some of the examples of, immigrants who may have come from Mexico, who committed really awful crimes, of those kind of being in the same ballpark as this ad. But I'm going to let this clip play for those of you who haven't watched this before. So this was not an ad put out by the Bush campaign, but it was an affiliate, somebody who was hoping that Bush would be able to capitalize on this ad. So am I sharing my screen? I think I forgot to do that.
Nope.
Okay. The audio may not quite work perfectly with this WebEx sharing.
It's such an effective video. You don't even really need the audio.
That's perfect. Perfectly well said. You get the point by.
Yeah.
supports the death penalty for first-degree murderers. Dukakis not only opposes the death penalty, he allowed first-degree murderers to have weekend passes from prison. One was Willie Horton, stabbing him 19 times. Despite a life sentence, Horton received 10 weekend passes from prison. Horton fled, kidnapped a young couple, stabbing the man and repeatedly raping his girlfriend. Weekend prison. Dukakis on crime.
Yeah, so there it is.
Put together in 30 seconds.
Yeah, really powerful ad for 30 seconds. You know, regarded historically, I mean, there's some really powerful ads of all time that may have influenced elections, and some ads have very minimal. Most ads have very minimal impact, but that one was successful, and you know, I think you nailed it, DeWitt, of how it even resonated with you.
Yeah, no, I mean, and it's again, it's just an example of the strategy, right? Let's find the ways in which we can galvanize people around fear and let them know if you vote for this other person, these things will happen, right? I mean, because the implication of the video is if you don't vote for Bush, then there will be a number of people who are out here doing these types of things, and a number of people, I mean, lifetime sentence or convicted murderers who've got a life sentence, they're going to be free, and they may hurt you or
Right.
someone you love. So you don't want that. No matter what you may think about this particular person as a candidate, you may not agree with everything, but you need to vote for him. It's usually a him. You need to vote for him because if not, this is your alternative. Um, you know, and it's very disingenuous and unfair, right? But again, in politics, as they say in love and war, everything is fair and nobody cares. As long as the winner doesn't care what I have to do in order to win. So I will exaggerate truths. I will push the fear as far as I can because this is a full contact sport, right? Political office is full contact.
I just wanted to highlight, you know, like you said, the facts don't seem to matter. You know, it doesn't matter if President Bush wins the election. This is a state level program with weekend furloughs, and it was something that was really popular in many states because it's cost effective, helps rehabilitate. It doesn't matter how many, statistically, how many people did something like what Willie Horton did. It doesn't matter that it wasn't Dukakis who created that program. Just like it doesn't matter, like statistically, undocumented immigrants are less likely to commit crimes in the United States. It's just, as you mentioned, the horrific anecdotes that we do have can be very, very powerful to voters. So really, the facts are less relevant in these kind of fear-based issues. One thing that I had written down too that I was hoping to weave in here, perhaps we missed the best spot for it earlier, but the millions of anywhere from 6.7 to 9.2 million Obama voters who flipped to Trump, and there was approximately 2.5 million Romney voters who supported Clinton. So, you know, roughly about a 4 to 7 million vote advantage of vote flipping from Obama supporters to Trump. And I just wanted to see, did you have, like, what do you think accounts for that? So millions of people who switched their vote, who in 2000, in some cases 2008 and 2012 voted for Obama, who then switched and voted for Trump.
Yeah, I can't say. I can only speculate. I would have to speculate that there were a number of people who felt that 8 years of Obama got them nothing. Um, and you know, there's always been this narrative around Obama that he's a little soft.
Hmm.
You know, he's a bit docile when it comes to pushing things through, whereas Trump presented himself as the exact opposite, right? Trump was a bully who was proud to be a bully, who used the executive order much differently than Obama did. So there may have been some people that felt that way, right? I know at the time in 2016, people put a lot of it on Hillary, saying that she just wasn't strong enough, and um, the whole super predator comment, which
Mm.
really pushed black people, rubbed black people in a bad way. Um, you know, non-black people as well. You know, there's always, I have to assume, even though we know assume means to make an ass out of you and me, right? I have to assume that sexism definitely had a part in it, right? There's some people that just say, I don't want a woman in office, no matter what, because she's going to have her own agenda. There's also this other narrative that even though Trump is who he is financially, that somehow or another Hillary and Bill both financially are just financial predators.
Mm.
You know, that they're of this near billionaire class who just all they think about is enriching themselves. Um, you know, and these are, again, this is all speculation. I have no sort of empirical information on any of this, right? But that has to be my guess, right? You know, and I've even heard some people say things like, well, America is a business. The country itself is a business, right? So if you want it run properly, you need someone who understands business. And Trump is
Mhm.
the best candidate because he is a businessman per se. Um, you know, all speculation, but that's the only thing or those are the things that come to mind.
I think those are all plausible. And I think that one of the things we have to acknowledge is that I don't think there's a single unifying theory. I think it's probably you have to include a lot of different factors like the ones you mentioned. And I think we can't, like you rightfully pointed out, you have to understand that it was essentially a binary choice that people have in each case. Perhaps some of the people in 2000 who were Obama supporters were weak Obama supporters. I think there could be examples like you mentioned of maybe ardent supporters of Obama who felt like he didn't do enough. But I would add that there could be, weaker Obama supporters who, perhaps didn't like the choice of McCain or didn't like the choice of Romney. One thing that Obama and Trump both had in common is they're very effective communicators. They use technology effectively to reach voters. And I think the people that stand out to me, and I don't really have data on this about what their racial background is, but I've heard a lot of interviews of long-term Democrats in Pennsylvania. There was I think the Daily podcast, the Daily had some interviews of people who had been like Democrats all their life in Pennsylvania, and Pennsylvania has been historically a pretty blue state. And like now they're literally, there was guys who were, this guy who was like, his job was to make Trump flags and got a Trump paraphernalia. Like he's such an ardent Trump supporter,
Mhm.
despite that his upbringing was very much, a strong Democrat. And so I think those are the people that I like to highlight in part because, states like Iowa, heck, even Indiana in 2008 voted for Democrat Obama and then I think Pennsylvania was just like the key state um,
Mhm.
of switching, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin is what cost the Democrats the election, what propelled Trump. And I think he did just a spectacular job of reaching like the people that I was just mentioning. And I think um, that, I'm a strong partisan but
Mhm.
I guess I did have, there's one candidate where I had shirts of in the past, but like to put out a flag, it's not something I would ever think of doing, but that's how passionate some people are. And
Yeah.
it's a way that like, I think Trump has validated their identity or um, made them feel like a sense of belonging. Perhaps when they were feeling more alienated, he brought out a lot of new voters too,
Mhm.
similar to what Obama was able to bring out a lot of new voters too. But I think we'd be remiss. I think there's something going on there, and I think that it's possible or even likely that there's some people who voted for Obama almost as like they're absolving themselves, like, okay, I voted for a black person, and now we're
Mhm.
good. We're good on race, and we can kind of move forward and close the book on that. And I think we discussed too at the end of the Obama administration, there was a lot of high-profile race-related issues, Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, and Barack Obama's identity himself. Perhaps could be a polarizing figure just because of his identity, the way that people perceived him.
Mhm.
And you've got interpretations that are out there of that as well. So it could be a lot of different issues. Um, one of the
Yeah.
things we go ahead.
Oh no, go ahead. Go ahead.
There's this concept of coalition of minorities that
Mhm.
sometimes is used in political science, and that it basically means, a president is on every decision that they make. there's always going to be a losing side. And so
Mhm.
that over time, you've got a coalition of these losing side minorities, not racial ethnic minorities, but just numerical minorities. So it could be like some of the issues we were mentioning earlier, whether it was transgender issues or immigration related issues, that people are feeling either alienated or upset by one thing Obama did, or one thing Biden did, or one thing Trump did. And so by the end of 4 to 8 years, you've got a pretty strong group of people who feel like their toes have been stepped on or been, upset about one particular issue, and that can push them to the other party. I'll turn it
Yeah,
back over.
no, that's a good point. And another point, sort of related to that, related, unrelated, I guess, I don't know. To anyone that's listening, particularly young people who's listening or may see this at some other time, I do want to stress that the sort of partisan divide and partisan competitiveness that we're talking about here, in my experience, when traveling, that competitiveness or this divide usually is almost isolated to political leadership. And what I mean by that is you take someone such as myself, let's say from Chicago. If I were to, or I have spent time in Texas or spent time in Florida, right? Because of my just taking in so much news and information and so many things about the country, I'm already skewed in my thinking, right? So this particular time in 2016, I'm going down to Texas with my sister. We went to Texas, and I'm automatically thinking when I get down here, people would not like me, right? They're not gonna like me. Obama's in office. He was in this last year, but it's not. They're gonna see me and think black guy south side of Chicago, Obama. This is Texas. This is not gonna work. And then you get into Texas. I got into Texas, and I got to the restaurant. I got to the hotel. I got to these other places, and these are some of the friendliest, nicest people. They were so welcoming. They showed so much. They were so hospitable. They were so loving. When we told them where we were from, right, and we returned it as well, right. We were just as friendly, made friends. These were non-black people, right? Made friends, and we talked about a number of different things. And we realized I did the same thing in Florida, I think 2018. And we talked about the differences and realized that really we have about 98% of our views in common,
Hmm.
right? We all want safety for our families, right? We all want the best schools for our children. We all want jobs where we're respected and that we enjoy, where we're paid a fair wage, right? We all want the ability to be safe, physical safety, right? We all want the healthcare that sort of answers to our needs, right? Whatever 2% we may have, that's the difference. This is what gets played gets played up on cable television, and this is what gets played up on social media. That 2%, and it makes it seem like it's much more magnified than it is, right? And the same thing internationally, right? When you travel internationally, the disagreement usually is among the leaders. The citizens are pretty much okay, right? I know, perfect example, you're from Nebraska, right? And I don't know the political background of Nebraska and how you grew up, right? And I'm from Chicago. I mean, you and I have built this friendship now for like, I think we first contacted each other like a year, almost a year ago,
Yeah.
right? So on paper, right, you and Kevin shouldn't be this cool, right? Because if you
Right.
look at the state of Nebraska and everything versus the, city of Chicago, I don't want to say Illinois, but city of Chicago, that's not supposed to work. But then you realize like, okay, the citizenry is much different, right? It's much different. And even with different views, you can respectfully have them and still be okay. But when you have a Governor Abbott versus Governor Pritzker, it almost seems like they can never even be in the same room,
Right.
right? And I think that's important for anyone that's listening who hasn't had those experiences, or who may say, "Oh, I'm never moving to Florida. I live in Chicago," or people who are in Kentucky, or "I would never move to New York. I would never move to Philadelphia." It's not what you think. Um, you know, humans are humans, and the unity, or I want to say the similarities, far more overlap than there are differences.
Yeah, very well said. And, I agree with that 100%. And it's really cool when you see those experiences like you just described, when you've got this kind of fear, but then you realize how uh, at, on the ground, people are really the humanity that most people have. Most people aren't the Twitter elites where you're constantly following what's going on in the headlines and interpreting it through your kind of partisan lens. A lot of people um, um, are deep down good. And I think there is a lot of great potential for us to connect and get along in like the scenarios that you describe, like especially in person. And you know, I think it'd be great. Maybe this summer we can do it a kind of an event or one of these discussions with you and I. Perhaps we talk about kind of just the differences of growing up and because you're right. I mean, I think growing up in Nebraska, you know, I had access to WGN News, and I was, you know, I was scared of Chicago. I didn't want to visit Chicago. I had stereotypes of Chicago. And then when I first did visit Chicago, and you know, all those were you know, you realize how off base all those stereotypes were, and how it felt like home when I came to Chicago, and how I've been able to meet so many different people. You know, I went to UIC and for graduate school, and when I did, there was no majority population, and you know, you got to meet people from all kinds of different backgrounds at UIC, and just like the impact that that had on my belief system, worldview, friendships that I had, and so forth. And so it'd be interesting to kind of just hear, you know, because I think you're right. If you took the average 100 people from my hometown in Fremont, Nebraska, and took 100 people from your community in the south side of Chicago, perhaps at face value, there'd be a lot of stereotypes and misperceptions and hesitancy to like go and meet somebody from each other's hometowns. But when they actually get the opportunity to do so, there's a lot of positive interaction, just like you described.
Yeah, I mean, it's just so it's so eye-opening, and you know, I felt almost embarrassed. I mean, at this time when I was having these experiences, I think I was in my 30s, and I'm like, you know, I consider myself informed, and you know, when you think you're smart, and you're like, wow, you know what I mean? Just like even you and I, right? You have to pick your daughter up from school. I have to pick my daughter, my son
Yeah.
up from school. Like these are things we have to do today. They're the same, right? You get your daughter, you're gonna spend time with her tonight. I'm gonna spend time with my daughter. We're gonna spend time with our wives. We're we are the same, right? But if you look at media representation, we're supposed to be so much different, right? Utah is supposed to be different than California. Texas is supposed to be different than Massachusetts, right? This is, and you realize, you know, the differences that do exist, they're being far more exaggerated. They're being over highlighted. And then that makes you really think, okay, well, what is the large agenda? Because obviously there is some profiting from our division. Um,
Absolutely. And you know, to your point, I bet we both read to our kids tonight. I bet we
yeah.
both we'll go watch the Bulls game tonight, most likely. I mean, we could go on and on. And you know, that's kind of perhaps a positive note to end on, and think about transitioning to our, you know, just putting a shout out to our last event. In 2 weeks, we're going to be talking about some of the challenges we have with democracy in the United States. And I think that as many of the challenges we have, I think that's one of the reasons to be hopeful, is that, you know, for all the reasons you just mentioned, that we don't need to be polarized. It's not natural to be this divided. I don't think it's healthy. And I think when you take those labels off, and you actually just get to meet other people and talk about what you really love, which for most people really isn't politics. And I really don't want to, I don't want to minimize and gloss over, like, a lot of people's identities are at stake and there's a lot of really bad things. I'm not trying to minimize that, but there's the potential, I think, for us to overcome that. And I'm glad that you mentioned that. And as always, great talking to you, DeWitt.
Oh man, my pleasure. I always enjoy the conversations.
And thanks to you in the audience, the participants today. And, you know, hopefully you're able to attend our last event 2 weeks from today. And look forward to sharing this recording with those out in our Moraine Valley community. So thanks again, DeWitt.
Thank you, Kevin.
All right, take care.
Yep, you too.